Hello, my name's Tania Cammarano, and I'm absolutely honoured to be speaking to you today as part of the CO.AS.IT's Italian-Australian Culture Series online. I think it's fantastic that even in the time of COVID-19, we're able to share our stories and our knowledge, and I really want to thank the CO.AS.IT for giving me this opportunity. You know, food is such an important part of culture. And even though it is often treated as colour in the story of immigration, particularly in the story of Italian immigrants, examining it in more detail can tell us much about ourselves. In Australia, the massive change that's occurred in our diet over the last 60 years or so is very often attributed to immigration. Other academics have rightly argued that other factors like industrialisation, travel, and economic prosperity have had a part to play. Immigration is certainly the popular explanation. It's the one you'll read about in the newspaper. And Italian immigrants have often been given a starring role in this narrative. That's because the way this story is often told involves Italian migrants coming to Australia with their pizza, their pasta, their espresso coffee, and continuing to eat in the same way they always have, either at home with their family or in cafes and restaurants that cater to their needs. Eventually, the local population either looked over the fence or ventured into these restaurants and cafes. They tasted what these migrants produce, declared it delicious, and before you know it, Australians know just as much about pasta carbonara and arancini as they do about shepherd's pie and roast beef. This is, of course, not how it happened. Such a narrative ignores the very many complex factors that are in play when food change occurs. And more than that, it places the migrants in the role of passive producers of their own food, doing what they've always done, albeit in a different country, waiting to be discovered by the dominant culture. It obscures the agency, the entrepreneurial drive, the innovation and skills that these migrants who had a role in changing Anglo-Australian taste so clearly had. In fact, they had to have them. Now, there's many Italian migrant companies and food companies I could tell you about that would illustrate these qualities, but I've chosen today to tell you the story of Natale and Maria Italiano, who founded the Perfect Cheese Company in 1930. There are some good reasons why their story forms the basis of my case study into how Australian-made Italian-style cheese entered the mainstream Australian diet. The first one is that the Italianos began making ricotta and pecorino in the backyard of their North Melbourne home in the 1930s, at a time when cheese in Australia really was synonymous with cheddar. In fact, if you wanted to enter your cheese into the Royal Melbourne Show and it wasn't cheddar, you just couldn't. There were no other categories other than cheddar to enter it into. In the 1930s, the Italianos really were pioneers at a time when the dominant culture viewed both Italian migrants and Italian cheese with a great deal of suspicion. Many other equally enterprising Italian companies and migrants followed in their footsteps. A small sample could include Floridia Cheese in the 50s, La Pasanella in the 60s, Pantalica in the 70s, right up to that Zamore in 2008. The other part of the Perfect Cheese story that intrigued me was the firm's success. By the time the Italianos sold their company to multinational Unigate in 1981, they were the sixth largest cheese producer in Australia. And the cheese they made had been celebrated and declared worthy of imitation by authorities. And Natale was held up by the Australian government as a role model, as the perfect migrant. So a transformation had occurred. And the obvious question for this historian was, how did it happen? Today, I want to explore the story of Natale in particular, because we know much less about Maria, unfortunately, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is later. So I want to explore this story about how he went and his company went from a small, obscure, even illegal business to a thriving company celebrated by mainstream Australia and protected by government authorities. I'll be using a range of primary sources, specifically material produced by the Dairying Division at the Department of Agriculture in Victoria. And I'm using these to trace this transformation and understand how Italian migrants and Italian cheese have gained cultural capital that simply seemed unattainable in the 1930s. Some background to begin. Natale migrated to Australia in 1922, leaving Scido, Calabria with just £2.10 in his pocket and the cheese-making skills he had acquired in his family's business. He worked in numerous manual labour jobs and found Maria when her brother, who Natale boarded with in Melbourne, showed him her picture. He briefly returned to Italy to meet and marry Maria, and they came back to Australia in 1927. In 1930, they began making and selling cheese to their Italian neighbours in North Melbourne, at the nearby Queen Victoria Market, and via door-to-door sales. Camilla Barbaro, who migrated to Melbourne from Italy in 1927, describes what it was like to buy cheese from the Italianos in those early days. As a young girl, I used to go to the Italiano's house in the next street to buy fresh ricotta. They used to boil the milk in a large copper, separate the ricotta, then give us also a large billy can of cero, the liquid left over from making the cheese. We also bought our cheese there, just primitive tools, very small containers and tiny premises. The cheese was padded with wooden paddles and put on homemade wooden shelves to dry out in a room out the back, a shed really. I really look forward to going to see the Italianos, just to buy the ricotta and look at all the cheeses they laid out on the shelves. They were happy days, but very poor days. So these early years were no doubt difficult. Between 1928 and 1940, Maria would give birth to 5 children, all who went on to work in the business. She was heavily involved in the making of the cheese at this time, despite the fact, as she told a CO.AS.IT interviewer in 1998, she didn't even like cheese. As the Depression deepened, Natalia describes how the company nearly came undone when it had no stores of unsold pecorino cheese and, as a result, no cash flow. It was reportedly an ad in the Italian language press that saved the company after Italian cane cutters in North Queensland saw it and promptly bought up all the stock. By 1935, things were improving. Natale and Maria moved to much bigger premises in Queensbury Street, and as early as 1937 had already begun producing feta and casseri for the Greek community, showing the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that would enable the Italianos to build a thriving company. But the 1930s were obviously not the best time to be Italian in Australia. There are many examples of discrimination and racism in the lead up to World War II, and obviously beyond that. But there's little evidence to suggest that Natale himself was the subject of this racism. He certainly never discussed it publicly, and Maria even told the CO.AS.IT that Natale did not suffer any racial discrimination. Perhaps this is because the Italianos operated outside the economic mainstream and did not compete directly with Anglo-Australians for jobs, unlike their cane-cutting compatriots in northern Queensland, for example. Or it might have been commercial discretion. Natale, who gave his company an English name, something not typical of Italian migrant manufacturers, either then or now, always appears to have had his eye on the mainstream market and possibly thought talk of racism was alienating. At that time, however, the Italianos and their business seemed to be largely ignored by Anglo-Australian society. While they advertised in the Italian language press, as you can see here, they rate no relevant mentions in the mainstream press. No record of them exists in the official papers of the dairying department, although, to be fair, those archives are not complete. But an official list of cheese and butter factories in Victoria in 1934 does not include the Perfect Cheese Company, though this could also suggest that they were operating outside the law. Because at this time, any cheese that was not cheddar was described as fancy cheese, which illustrates its relative exoticness and outsider status. In 1936, for example, a request to make Roquefort in Victoria was met with this sentiment from the Director of Dairying. I am of the opinion that the matter is not worth pursuing further. Fancy cheese, even made from cow's milk, command no attention in Victoria. It is quite improbable that Roquefort would be considered at all. As late as 1966, new federal food regulations required mozzarella, amongst other cheeses, to have set moisture and fat levels. Unfortunately for the Perfect Cheese Company, the limits set by the regulations were challenging, as Alfredo Italiano, Natale's son and a director of the company, pointed out when he told authorities, "This company is the leading manufacturer of mozzarella cheese in Australia, and we have found that it is almost impossible to produce a mozzarella cheese which is acceptable to consumers of the product and which complies with the requirements of the schedule." While the limits did eventually change, it was not before the Perfect Cheese Company was prosecuted for the lack of fat in their mozzarella. Former barrister, Governor of Victoria, as well as Emeritus Professor of the CO.AS.IT, Sir James Gobbo, describes defending Natale, who he says was relentlessly prosecuted by the authorities for selling mozzarella cheese, which, they argued, did not contain sufficient milk. It should be noted, though, that this was the Department of Health, not the Department of Agriculture, that was responsible for prosecuting under this legislation. It's significant because in the 1950s, in the papers of the Department of Agriculture, a shift can be detected, both in terms of Natale's rising reputation and the regard with which the cheese he produced is held. Also in the 1950s, against the backdrop of a dramatic increase in Italian immigration, the Perfect Cheese Company published a booklet to celebrate its silver anniversary. At this point, Natale could have continued to have a successful business just by marketing to the increasing Italian population, which which metropolitan Melbourne was 12 times larger than it had been when the business began, but he didn't do this. This booklet confidently marketed his cheeses to the mainstream. In the age of assimilation, that this book is published in both Italian and English is an example of multiculturalism well before such a term became fashionable. The Italian foreword is written by Capuchin priest Nazario Mammi, who says that Natale's name is among those of Italians in Australia, which deserves to be counted among one of those who most honoured his homeland. He notes Natale has an indomitable spirit of enterprise and determination to fight against all difficulties in an effort to make his company one that can be admired by all. The English foreword, however, is written by none other than Superintendent of Dairying T.M. Jensen, who writes, "The success of Perfect Cheese therefore speaks volumes for the skill and ability of Mr. N.P. Italiano, both as a cheesemaker and as a businessman, that he has been able in such a short space of time to build up such a thriving business as the Perfect Cheese Company." That the Italianos included these observations could be seen as self-indulgent, but if we consider the dual audience that the company is seemingly trying to target, we can see these choices as strategic. That the company was preparing to list on the stock exchange, a feat they achieved in 1959, could have something to do with their desire to grow their market amongst mainstream consumers. But the Italianos weren't just good at marketing strategy. Innovation was very much in the company's DNA. The most outstanding example of this was the opening of Australia's first sheep milk dairy in 1967. That it was an Italian immigrant family who were the first to commercially produce sheep's milk cheese, especially in a country said to have ridden to prosperity on that animal's back, is impressive. But it wasn't the company's first attempt at innovation. They tried goat's milk production when no one else was. They opened a piggery to deal with factory waste. They invented new cheese types when they saw a market for them and adapted their cheese range to meet changing consumer demands, all the while educating both consumers and wholesalers through extensive advertising in the mainstream and trade press, as well as through the release of several recipe brochures and a cookbook. These actions appeared to increasingly impress those in positions of power in the dominant culture, and Perfect Cheese began to strongly move from outsider to insider status. How insider Perfect Cheese had become by the late 1950s is illustrated in a series of documents in the Dairying Division archives. When an Italy-based Parmigiano Reggiano maker requested help to set up a factory in Victoria, Superintendent Jensen wrote, "I wish to advise that the Perfect Cheese Company Melbourne is already manufacturing a wide variety of Italian cheese, which meet the entire Australian demand and leave a balance for export. I therefore feel that it is incumbent upon me to refrain from any step that would jeopardise the business of Australian factories in favour of a foreign firm." Further evidence of how far Perfect Cheese had come can be seen in the record of a dairy factory licence hearing. Cheesemakers who did not produce their own milk in Victoria needed one of these licenses, and it was standard practice for existing cheese companies to lodge objections. Perfect Cheese made frequent appearances at dairy license hearings, often successfully arguing on the grounds that the milk supply in the area was not sufficient and that a market for an existing cheese would be damaged. The application which illustrates the sway the company held, however, is one to which it did not object. In 1958, Simon and Eva Goldman applied for a dairy license to make soft cheese from skim milk in an East Preston factory. Mr. Park, the senior milk products officer, as well as a member of the board, added that NP Italiano Pty Ltd had offered no objection to the application. The board concurs in this and therefore recommends the application be approved. Clearly, Natale's lack of objection carried a significant amount of weight with the Dairy Licence Board. In 1973, a statement from Federal Minister for Immigration Al Grasby promoting Australia's immigration policy is accompanied by short migrant success stories. Natale features in a suit inspecting the cheese of one of his workers. The caption reads that Natale recalls, "There were no red carpets waiting for me, but today he owns his own cheese factory in Melbourne." The subtext is that these are the kind of excellent quality migrants that Australia has already attracted, ones that work hard and whose success contributes to the national good. Natale is no longer an outsider, but increasingly a model Australian whose business success should be emulated. This sentiment is visible in a 1979 memo from the Victorian Minister for Agriculture to his department. Titled Ethnic Cheesemakers, the minister asked, "I would like to encourage people to manufacture traditional European cheeses in, if necessary, a small way. Would you please advise me how we can facilitate this?" What followed were letters, minutes of meetings, and opinions of experts on what the barriers were for ethnic cheesemakers and how the government could help to overcome them. The discussion indicated that fancy cheese, newly christened ethnic cheese in the age of multiculturalism, was no longer unimportant and its production needed to be encouraged, as did the people who made the cheeses, the ethnic cheesemakers. What would Natale have made of this? That the government now wanted to actively encourage small-scale ethnic cheesemakers, just like he had been, to produce ethnic cheeses just like he had, must have felt like a validation of his life's work and testament to his ability to have done this without the support, at least initially, of government authorities. The transformation from suspect migrant to model Australian is complete. And evidence that the cheese Natale and his family made is no longer just for a small ethnic community can be seen in the top left of this image, which is from a 1968 cookbook. This book is not just another cookbook, however. It is the Margaret Fulton cookbook, one of the most influential books ever published in Australia by one of its most influential authors. Inclusion here for Perfect Cheese illustrates that the company had taken a significant foothold in the dominant culture. In the 51 years that the Perfect Cheese Company was majority owned by the Italiano family, the complexion of Australia changed. From a British-based society which valued plain English-style food to a multicultural, multiculinary one, Natale himself acknowledges that immigration and changing Australian tastes were crucial in the business success. However, in the celebratory story, which equates acceptance of ethnic food with acceptance of ethnic people, the agency of migrants like Natale is lost, it's obscured. Australia's multicultural palate did not develop because adventurous Anglo-Australians simply discovered the food of migrants. As we have seen, Natale and his family did not passively wait to be discovered by anyone. They actively sought new ways of expanding products and markets. Natale had what historian Francesco Riccardi has described as transcultural skills. That is, the skills required to work, to live, and to thrive in transcultural spaces. So I am sure did his wife, Maria, who, even though a director in the company for its entire duration, is barely visible in the historical material, illuminating the role women like Maria played in transforming Italians from suspect migrants to model Australians could be viewed as the next big challenge for historians such as myself. Thank you.